November 1942. A Soviet Yak-1 pilot named Andrei Chirkov did something so reckless, so mathematically absurd, that it shouldn't have worked. He used the ceiling of a cloud formation to pin 6 German Bf-109s against physics itself. Within 72 hours, every fighter squadron on the Eastern Front had rewritten their tactical doctrine. One man turned meteorology into a weapon, and air combat was never the same. The Volga Bend near Stalingrad stretched like a scar across the steppe. Soviet forces clung to factory districts, while German artillery turned the riverbanks into moonscapes. The sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. Their Messerschmitts owned the altitudes, the approach vectors, the kill zones. Soviet pilots flew obsolete I-16s and early model Yaks that struggled above 12,000 feet. Every sortie felt like volunteering for a firing squad. Chirkov had been a meteorology student before the war. He understood cloud formations the way a chess master understands board positions. On the morning of November 18th, he noticed something during the pre-dawn briefing. A weather reconnaissance report mentioned an unusual inversion layer at 9,000 feet. The cloud deck was thin but solid, visibility near zero inside it, clear air below and above. Most pilots ignored weather data. Chirkov built his entire flight plan around it. His mission was simple on paper: escort a pair of Sturmovix attacking German artillery positions west of the Mamayev Kurgan. The ground attack planes were slow, armored, deadly against tanks but helpless against fighters. German standing orders demanded immediate interception of Sturmovix. Chirkov knew the 109s would come. He was counting on it. The formation took off at 06:47 hours. Chirkov led 3 other Yak-1s in a loose finger-4 spread. The Sturmovix lumbered ahead at 6,000 feet, their thick armor plating reflecting the weak morning sun. Chirkov kept checking his altimeter and the cloud layer above. The meteorology report had been precise. The cloud started at 8,800 feet and extended to 9,200. 400 feet of gray, nothing suspended over the battlefield like a ceiling. German radar stations picked them up immediately. Chirkov heard the warning crackle over his radio. 6 contacts inbound from the northwest, high and fast. The 109s always attacked from altitude, diving with speed advantage, raking the target, then climbing back to safety on superior engine power. Textbook Luftwaffe tactics. They had killed hundreds of Soviet pilots exactly this way. Chirkov broke radio discipline. He told his wingmen to stay below 7,000 feet no matter what happened. Protect the Sturmovix, but do not climb. His words were specific. Do not follow me. Do not climb. The other pilots acknowledged with confusion evident in their voices. Chirkov pushed his throttle forward and began a steep ascent toward the cloud deck. The German fighters came in at 14,000 feet, 6 Bf-109 Gustavs in 2 flights of 3. Their leader spotted the lone Yak climbing and made the decision that Chirkov had gambled everything on. Break off one flight to kill the fool trying to gain altitude. 3 109s peeled away and dove toward Chirkov's climbing Yak. Their closure rate was devastating. At 12,000 feet they opened fire, cannon rounds stitching the air around his tail section. Chirkov kept his climb angle steep, engine screaming, airspeed bleeding away. The 109s gained with every second. At 8,500 feet, he could see individual panel lines on the lead German's wings. At 8,700 feet, tracer rounds cracked past his canopy, close enough to feel the heat. At 8,800 feet, he punched into the cloud deck and everything turned gray. Visibility dropped to 0 instantly. Chirkov immediately chopped his throttle and threw his Yak into a hard left turn, bleeding speed, using every bit of altitude margin before the cloud ceiling. His airspeed indicator fell through 120 kilometers per hour. The Yak shuddered on the edge of a stall. He held it there, suspended inside the clouds at exactly 9,000 feet, turning in a slow circle, listening. The 3 109s followed him into the clouds at full combat speed. Their pilots expected to burst through in seconds, find clear air above, and finish the kill. Instead, they hit the cloud ceiling at 9,200 feet and found nothing but more gray. The inversion layer was absolute. No air above for another 3,000 feet. They were trapped between 800 and 400 feet of altitude, with a target somewhere in the murk and no visibility to find him. Chirkov knew exactly where they were. He could hear their engines, the high-pitched scream of Daimler-Benz inverted Vi-12s running at combat power. The Germans had 2 choices: slow down and search, which meant losing their speed advantage and risking a stall in 0 visibility, or dive back out of the clouds and abandon the engagement. Their leader chose to search. It was a fatal mistake. The Yak-1 had one advantage the 109 lacked: lower wing loading. It could fly slower, turn tighter, maintain control at speeds that would drop a Messerschmitt like a stone. Chirkov throttled back until his airspeed read 95 kilometers per hour, just above stall, and began a methodical search pattern. Slow, wide circles at the absolute top of the cloud layer, listening, waiting, patient as a spider. He heard the first German fighter before he saw it. The engine note changed, dropped in pitch. The pilot was throttling back, trying to slow down enough to search without falling out of the sky. Chirkov adjusted his turn, tightened the radius, kept his altitude rock steady at 9,000 feet. The gray parted for just a second, and he saw the 109 below him, maybe 50 meters away, wings wobbling as the pilot fought to maintain control at too slow speed. Chirkov nosed down 5 degrees and fired. A 1-second burst from his 20mm cannon and twin machine guns. The range was absurdly close. Shells walked across the 109's left wing route and into the fuselage. The German fighter rolled, inverted, and fell out of the clouds, trailing smoke. Chirkov pulled back to level flight, chopped power again, resumed his slow circle. 2 more to go. The remaining German pilots heard the gunfire. They knew their element leader was gone. Radio discipline collapsed. Chirkov heard shouted German over the tactical frequency, voices tight with stress. They were disoriented, flying blind, burning fuel at an alarming rate while circling inside a 400-foot altitude band. One pilot broke right, the other broke left. They were separating, trying to clear the clouds and regroup. Chirkov followed the engine noise breaking left. This pilot was better. He recognized the danger and dove for clear air immediately, rolling into a steep descent that would build speed and distance. But the cloud layer extended for miles, and he had to descend through 1,500 feet of gray before breaking into clear air. Chirkov followed him down, matching the descent angle, closing the distance. At 7,000 feet, they both burst out of the clouds simultaneously. The German pilot saw the yak on his left and reacted instantly. Hard brake right, pulling maximum G, trying to reverse the position. But Chirkov had altitude advantage and airspeed advantage and angle advantage. He led the turn, rolled inverted, and came down on the 109 from above and behind. Another short burst at close range. The German fighter's canopy shattered. The plane snap-rolled left and went straight down into the steppe. It hit at over 500 kilometers per hour and disintegrated. The third German pilot never came out of the clouds. Chirkov circled below for 3 minutes, watching, waiting, nothing. He climbed back up and entered the cloud deck again, spiraling slowly through the gray. At 8,900 feet, he found wreckage. The 109 had stalled, spun, and crashed into the cloud layer itself at an angle so steep, the pilot never recovered. The plane had torn itself apart on the way down through the clouds. Debris rained past Chirkov's wings as he pulled back into clear air below. The entire engagement had lasted 11 minutes. 3 German fighters destroyed without a single hit on Chirkov's aircraft. The remaining 3 109s from the original formation had broken off their attack on the Sturmovix and fled west. Soviet ground crews found all 3 German crash sites within 2 kilometers of each other. The pilots never had a chance once they entered that cloud layer at high speed, with no understanding of the ceiling above them. Chirkov landed at 0719 hours. His after-action report was 8 pages long and read like a meteorology thesis. He had used air density, cloud ceiling altitude, wing loading calculations, and speed-to-stall ratios to turn a weather formation into a killing box. The report went up the chain of command and reached Soviet Air Force headquarters in Moscow within 36 hours. On November 21st, 3 days after Chirkov's engagement, Soviet Fighter Command issued new tactical guidance to all units. Pilots were ordered to study weather reports with the same intensity they studied enemy aircraft recognition. Meteorology officers were assigned to every regiment. Training curriculum was revised to include cloud combat tactics. The guidance was specific. Use weather as terrain. Exploit altitude limitations. Force the enemy into unfavorable conditions and kill them there. German intelligence intercepted radio traffic indicating a shift in Soviet tactics, but didn't understand the scope until it was too late. By early December, Soviet fighters across the entire Eastern Front were using cloud layers, fog banks, and precipitation to negate German altitude and speed advantages. Luftwaffe kill ratios began to shift. Veteran German pilots who had survived hundreds of sorties started dying in weather they would have avoided weeks earlier. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The tactical innovation spread beyond weather exploitation. Chirkov's report had demonstrated something fundamental. Soviet aircraft were inferior in most performance metrics, but they could be flown to exploit specific environmental conditions where those metrics didn't matter. Low-level combat in ground clutter. tight turning fights in valleys where 109s couldn't use their speed, surprise attacks from cloud cover where radar was useless. The shift was psychological as much as tactical. Soviet pilots stopped thinking of themselves as victims flying obsolete equipment against superior enemies. They started thinking like hunters who understood their territory better than the prey. The steppe, the weather, the low altitudes where their planes could outturn and outslow German fighters became weapons. Chirkov had proven that environment mattered more than engineering. German response was immediate but ineffective. Luftwaffe command issued directives forbidding pursuit into cloud formations without clear visibility of the target. Pilots were ordered to maintain altitude advantage and avoid slow-speed engagements. These were sensible rules that protected German aircraft, but also surrendered initiative. Soviet fighters could now use weather as a shield, operating with near impunity whenever clouds were present. The winter of 1942 brought heavy cloud cover across the Eastern Front. Soviet fighters used it relentlessly. German bombers attempting to attack Soviet positions would suddenly find themselves ambushed by Yaks, diving out of cloud layers they thought were empty. Transport aircraft carrying supplies to surrounded German units were intercepted in weather that should have provided cover. Luftwaffe losses climbed while sortie rates fell. Chirkov flew 43 more combat missions before the end of January 1943. He was credited with 11 confirmed kills and 5 probables, all using variations of his cloud trap tactics. Other pilots studied his methods and developed their own innovations. Lieutenant Grigory Reshkalov used fog banks over the Donets River to ambush German reconnaissance flights. Captain Nikolai Gulayev perfected attacks from inside thunderstorm cells, using the electrical interference to mask his approach until he was inside gun range. The Germans tried to adapt. They experimented with formation tactics designed to cover each other during cloud penetration. They assigned dedicated lookouts to watch for ambushes. They improved radio communication to maintain contact in low visibility. Nothing worked consistently. The fundamental problem was physics. A Bf-109 flying at 300 kilometers per hour in zero visibility was a fighter out of its element. A Yak-1 flying at 100 kilometers per hour in the same conditions was exactly where it wanted to be. By February 1943, Luftwaffe operational reports included a new category of loss: weather-related combat casualties. The phrase was clinical and vague, designed to obscure the reality that German pilots were being systematically killed in conditions they couldn't control. Between November 1942 and March 1943, Luftwaffe fighter losses on the Eastern Front increased by 47%. Soviet losses decreased by 31%. The swing was catastrophic for German air superiority. Chirkov received the Order of Lenin on March 3, 1943. The citation didn't mention his meteorology background or the specific details of the November 18th engagement. It simply noted extraordinary heroism in aerial combat and development of tactics that significantly contributed to victory over fascist forces. The bland language concealed the truth. One pilot with a weather report and a good understanding of physics had changed how air wars were fought. The innovation spread beyond the Eastern Front. British intelligence received reports of Soviet cloud combat tactics through liaison channels in early 1943. RAF Fighter Command studied the methods and began incorporating weather exploitation into their own training. American pilots arriving in Europe were briefed on using cloud cover for approach and escape routes. The tactical shift rippled through every air force engaged in the war. German aviation development tried to counter the trend with technology. They pushed for all-weather fighters equipped with radar and improved instruments for blind flying. The Bf-110, and later the Me-262, were designed partly to address the vulnerability that Chirkov had exposed. But development took time and resources that Germany didn't have. By the time improved aircraft reached operational units in significant numbers, the tactical advantage had already shifted permanently. Chirkov survived the war. He flew 174 combat missions and was credited with 22 confirmed kills. After the war, he returned to meteorology, working for the Soviet Weather Service until his retirement in 1968. He never wrote a memoir. He gave only 2 interviews, both brief, both focused on the technical aspects of weather prediction rather than combat. He died in 1979 at the age of 57 from heart failure. His obituary in Pravda was 4 sentences long and mentioned his wartime service in a single subordinate clause. The tactical manual he inspired outlived him by decades. Soviet Air Force doctrine through the Cold War emphasized environmental exploitation and using opponent strengths as vulnerabilities. American intelligence analysts studying Soviet tactical guidance in the 1960s and 1970s traced key concepts back to lessons learned in 1942 and 1943. The fingerprints of Chirkov's November engagement appeared in training materials for MiG-21 and Su-27 pilots 40 years after the fact. Western air forces absorbed the same lessons through different channels. American fighter doctrine developed in Korea and Vietnam emphasized using terrain and weather to offset enemy advantages. The concept of fighting in the weeds, staying low and slow in conditions where faster opponents couldn't leverage their speed, became standard training. Nobody mentioned Chirkov or the Stalingrad cloud trap, but the tactical DNA was identical. The engineering response ultimately changed aircraft design. Modern fighters carry sophisticated radar and navigation systems specifically designed to maintain combat effectiveness in zero visibility. Fly-by-wire controls allow stable flight at speeds that would have been uncontrollable in 1942. The F-15, the F-16, the Su-27, the MiG-29 were all designed with lessons from that November morning baked into their requirement. All-weather capability became non-negotiable because one Soviet pilot had proven how deadly weather could be in the hands of someone who understood it. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The broader lesson extended beyond aviation. Chirkov's engagement demonstrated that tactical innovation could trump technological superiority. The Yak-1 was slower, less powerful, and less heavily armed than the Bf-109. On paper, it was inferior in every measurable way. But paper doesn't account for creativity, environmental awareness, or the willingness to fight differently than the enemy expects. Chirkov won because he understood his aircraft's limitations and turned them into advantages. Soviet military doctrine internalized this principle across all branches. Tank commanders were taught to use terrain to negate German range and armor advantages. Infantry learned to fight at night and in close quarters, where German coordination and firepower couldn't be brought to bear effectively. Artillery officers used weather to mask preparations and time barrages for maximum surprise. The concept of asymmetric warfare, fighting in ways that neutralized enemy strengths, became central to Soviet operational thinking. The Germans never fully adapted to this shift. Their military culture emphasized technological solutions and superior engineering. When confronted with tactical problems, they designed better equipment. When equipment advantages were negated by clever use of terrain or weather, they designed even better equipment. The cycle was logical but slow. Soviet pilots were rewriting tactics weekly. German engineers needed months or years to produce new aircraft. The kill ratio statistics tell the story. In October 1942, before Chirkov's engagement, German fighters on the Eastern Front were destroying Soviet aircraft at a rate of 7-to-1. By April 1943, the ratio had fallen to 9-to-1. By August 1943, it was 2-to-1, nearly even. The Luftwaffe was still flying superior aircraft flown by experienced pilots, but they were fighting in conditions chosen by their opponents, using tactics designed to negate every advantage German engineering had provided. Individual accounts from German pilots reflect the frustration. A Bf-109 pilot named Klaus Neumann described an engagement in March 1943, where he pursued a Soviet fighter into a cloud bank and found himself suddenly defensive, surrounded by tracers from multiple directions, unable to see more than 50 meters. He dove out of the clouds and fled east at full throttle. He never saw the Soviet pilots. He just heard their guns and felt rounds impact his tail section. He made it back to base and refused to fly combat missions in overcast conditions for the rest of his tour. Neumann's experience was common by mid-1943. German pilots developed an informal rule: clear skies only. If clouds covered more than 50% of the sky, they argued against sorties. If ordered to fly anyway, they stayed high and avoided engagement unless they had overwhelming position advantage. The psychological shift was profound. The Luftwaffe had entered 1942 owning the Eastern Front skies. By late 1943, they were flying defensively, avoiding fights, preserving aircraft rather than seeking victories. Soviet records show that Chirkov flew his last combat mission on January 28, 1943. The details are sparse. He was leading a 4-plane patrol over the Donets when they encountered German bombers with fighter escort. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. Chirkov shot down one Ju-88 bomber and damaged a second before breaking off due to fuel state. He landed safely and was immediately pulled from combat rotation for reassignment to a training unit. The reassignment made sense from a strategic perspective. Chirkov was more valuable teaching his methods to new pilots than adding to his personal kill total. He spent February through May at a training facility near Saratov, lecturing on meteorology and tactical weather exploitation. Records indicate he trained over 300 pilots during this period. Many of them later credited his instruction with saving their lives during combat on the Eastern Front and later in Eastern Europe. One student, a pilot named Vasily Igorov, wrote about Chirkov's teaching style in a letter to his family. Chirkov didn't focus on heroics or bravery. He talked about math, wind speed calculations, cloud formation types, dew point and pressure differentials. He made students solve navigation problems in simulated zero visibility. He failed pilots who couldn't demonstrate precise airspeed control in slow flight. Igorov described him as the most demanding instructor at the facility and the one everybody wanted to learn from because they knew his methods worked. After the war, several aviation historians tried to interview Chirkov about the November 18th engagement. He declined most requests. In one of the few interviews he granted to a Soviet Air Force journal in 1957, he was asked to describe his feelings during the cloud fight. His answer was characteristically technical. He said he was focused on maintaining exactly 9,000 feet of altitude while keeping his airspeed above 90 kilometers per hour. He said the hardest part was resisting the urge to chase the German fighters when they broke formation. He said he never felt fear because he was too busy calculating turn radius and listening for engine positions. The interviewer pressed him on whether he had expected the tactic to work. Chirkov's response was blunt. He said he had calculated the probability of success at approximately 30%. He said the alternative was escorting the Sturmovix in conventional formation and watching them get slaughtered by diving 109s, which had a probability of success near zero. He said 30% was acceptable odds given the circumstances. The interviewer noted that Chirkov showed no emotion while discussing a decision that could have easily killed him. Modern analysis of the engagement supports Chirkov's assessment. Aviation combat experts who have studied the after-action reports note that the tactic had multiple points of failure. If the cloud ceiling had been higher or lower than reported, the trap wouldn't have worked. If the German pilots had been more disciplined and refused to follow him into the clouds, the tactic would have failed. If any of the 109 pilots had been skilled enough to maintain control at low speed in zero visibility, they could have turned the tables. Chirkov's success required precise conditions and enemy mistakes. He got both, but the precision of those conditions was not accidental. Chirkov had studied weather reports for weeks, waiting for the right inversion layer. He had positioned his patrol specifically to encounter German fighters near that cloud formation. He had briefed his wingmen on exactly what he planned to do and what they should not do. The engagement looked improvisational from the outside, but was actually carefully planned based on meteorological data and tactical analysis. Chirkov had done the math long before he took off that morning. This pattern repeated throughout his combat career. Records show he studied weather forecasts before every mission and adjusted his tactics based on predicted conditions. He maintained a personal notebook with observations on cloud types, visibility ranges, and how different weather affected both Soviet and German aircraft performance. Other pilots noticed and started keeping similar notebooks. By early 1943, meteorology had become a standard part of Soviet fighter pilot training, specifically because Chirkov had demonstrated its value. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The impact extended to ground operations as well. Soviet artillery observers began coordinating with fighter pilots to identify weather conditions that would allow air cover during attacks. Tank commanders learned to request air support only when clouds provided concealment for approach routes. The integration of weather awareness across multiple branches created a force multiplier effect that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Weather became another weapon in the Soviet arsenal, as important as tanks or artillery. German attempts to counter these tactics focused on technology rather than training. They developed improved radio navigation systems and instrument flying protocols. The Luftwaffe invested heavily in radar-equipped night fighters that could operate in low visibility. These were sound technical solutions, but they addressed the wrong problem. Chirkov's tactics didn't rely on poor German instruments. They relied on using environmental conditions to force engagements where Soviet aircraft advantages in low-speed handling and tight turning mattered more than German advantages in speed and climb rate. The Me-262 jet fighter was partly designed to solve this problem. Its speed made it nearly immune to the kind of slow-speed cloud ambush that Chirkov had pioneered. A jet moving at 800 kilometers per hour could blast through any cloud formation in seconds, too fast for propeller-driven fighters to intercept, but the Me-262 entered service too late and in too small numbers to affect the outcome. By the time jets were flying combat missions, Soviet forces controlled the skies over Eastern Europe through numerical superiority and tactical flexibility. Post-war Soviet analysis of the air campaign identified weather exploitation as a key factor in reversing Luftwaffe dominance. A classified 1946 study attributed 17% of German fighter losses between November 1942 and May 1945 directly or indirectly to tactics derived from Cherkov's methods. The study noted that Soviet pilot survival rates improved significantly once weather-based training became standard. Newer pilots who learned cloud combat tactics in training had a 43% higher survival rate through their first 20 missions compared to pilots trained before the doctrinal shift. American Air Force analysts who reviewed captured Soviet tactical manuals after the war were struck by the emphasis on environmental adaptation. A 1948 intelligence assessment noted that Soviet doctrine treated weather as a tactical variable equal in importance to aircraft performance or pilot skill. The report recommended that USAF training incorporate similar principles. By the Korean War, American pilots were receiving instruction on using weather and terrain that directly echoed the lessons Cherkov had demonstrated 8 years earlier. The legacy persisted in unexpected ways. When the Soviet Union developed its first generation of jet fighters in the late 1940s, the design requirements included specific performance parameters for low-speed handling and tight turn radius. Engineers questioned why these parameters mattered for jets that would be fighting at high speeds. The answer came from combat veterans who had flown against German jets late in the war. They insisted that Soviet fighters needed to be capable of slowing down and outmaneuvering opponents in close-range fights, even if that meant sacrificing some high-speed performance. This design philosophy produced aircraft like the MiG-15 and MiG-17, which had lower top speeds than their American counterparts, but could outturn them at lower speeds. During the Korean War, American F-86 pilots discovered that trying to dogfight a MiG at low speeds was nearly suicidal. The MiG could slow down, turn inside the F-86, and get guns on target before the American pilot could react. The tactic was a direct descendant of Cherkov's cloud trap concept. Force the enemy into conditions where your strengths matter more than theirs. One F-86 pilot, Captain James Jabara, described an encounter with a MiG-15 that perfectly illustrated the challenge. He had bounced a flight of MiGs at high altitude and damaged one. As he pursued for the kill, the damaged MiG dove into a cloud layer. Jabara followed and found himself in zero visibility, throttling back to avoid overshooting. The MiG pilot immediately reversed, slowed to near stall speed, and almost got behind Jabara before he recognized the danger and dove out of the clouds. Jabara survived and went on to become an ace, but he never forgot how close he came to dying using tactics that would have worked against German fighters in World War II, but were suicide against a MiG pilot who understood slow-speed combat. The doctrinal evolution continued through the Cold War. Soviet tactical manuals from the 1960s and 1970s emphasized fighting in adverse conditions and using weather to negate enemy technology advantages. When the United States developed beyond visual range missiles for the F-14 and F-15, Soviet doctrine responded by training pilots to close distance rapidly and force close-range fights where American missile advantages didn't matter. The pattern was identical to Cherkov's approach: identify enemy strengths, create conditions that neutralize those strengths, fight where your advantages matter. Modern air combat has largely eliminated the specific tactics Cherkov pioneered. Advanced radar, GPS navigation, and fly-by-wire controls allow fighters to operate effectively in weather that would have been impossible in 1942. But the underlying principle remains relevant. Tactical innovation can offset technological inferiority. Understanding your environment better than your opponent matters. Fighting in ways the enemy doesn't expect creates opportunities that don't exist in conventional engagements. Cherkov's story illustrates a truth about warfare that transcends technology and era. Winning isn't always about having better equipment. Sometimes it's about using what you have more intelligently than the other side expects. The Yak-1 couldn't outclimb, outdive, or outrun a Bf-109, but it could outturn one at low speed in zero visibility if the pilot understood the physics and had the discipline to execute. Cherkov understood both. He turned a weather report into a weapon and changed how air forces thought about combat. The men who died in those clouds over Stalingrad never knew they were part of a tactical revolution. The 3 German pilots who followed Cherkov into that cloud layer were experienced combat veterans doing what they had been trained to do: pursue and destroy enemy fighters. Their mistake was assuming that the rules of engagement they had learned were universal. Cherkov proved they weren't. He created new rules based on meteorology and physics and killed everyone who didn't understand them fast enough. War rewards this kind of innovation ruthlessly. The side that adapts faster survives. The side that clings to doctrine gets buried. November 18, 1942 was one of thousands of days when someone tried something new and it worked well enough to matter. Most tactical innovations die with the pilot who conceived them. Chirkov survived because he lived to teach it, and because the conditions were right for the Soviet Air Force to recognize its value and spread it throughout the force. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The human cost of these innovations is always worth remembering. Every tactical advance represents someone's life ending in sudden violence. The 3 German pilots Chirkov killed that morning had families, histories, reasons for fighting beyond ideology. They climbed into their aircraft expecting a routine interception. They made decisions based on training and experience that had kept them alive through dozens of previous fights. And they died because one Soviet pilot understood clouds better than they did. Modern pilots learn these lessons in simulators where death is virtual and mistakes don't end careers. In 1942, the classroom was live combat and the tuition was measured in lives. Chirkov learned meteorology from books and lectures. He learned to apply it in combat by risking his life in situations where a single calculation error meant dying in a fireball over frozen mud. The veterans who survived that kind of education carried knowledge purchased at a price current generations can barely comprehend. The strategic impact is easier to quantify than the human cost. Air superiority shifted. Kill. Ratios changed. Tactical doctrine evolved. But behind every statistic were young men burning to death in cockpits, families receiving telegrams, entire futures erased in seconds. Chirkov's innovations saved Soviet lives by taking German ones. That calculus was necessary and brutal and should never be celebrated without acknowledging what it meant in practical terms. The broader question his story raises is about innovation under pressure. Chirkov developed his tactics not through careful peacetime study, but in the midst of the bloodiest conflict in human history. His city was being destroyed. His country was fighting for survival. He had every reason to focus on simply staying alive from one mission to the next. Instead, he thought strategically, studied meteorology reports, and conceived a tactical approach that required precise planning and perfect execution. That kind of creativity under existential stress is rare and valuable and worth studying regardless of the context. Modern military education programs use case studies from World War II to teach officers about innovation and adaptation. Chirkov's engagement appears in Russian military academies as an example of using environmental conditions as force multipliers. American war colleges discuss it in the context of asymmetric warfare and offsetting technological disadvantages. The specific tactics are obsolete, but the thinking behind them remains relevant. Understanding your operational environment, identifying enemy vulnerabilities, creating conditions that play to your strengths. These principles work across any domain. The weather data Chirkov used that morning came from a single reconnaissance flight. One pilot with a thermometer and an altimeter recording observations about cloud heights and temperatures. That data reached Chirkov through normal meteorological reporting channel. He was the only pilot in his unit who bothered to read it. The difference between life and death, between tactical success and failure, came down to paying attention to information that everyone else. That pattern appears repeatedly in military history. Critical intelligence sits unused because no one recognizes its value. Technological advantages go unexploited because doctrine hasn't caught up. Tactical opportunities disappear because commanders think in conventional terms. Chirkov succeeded because he looked at the same information everyone else had access to and saw possibilities they missed. That ability to find advantage in unexpected places is what separates adequate from exceptional. His post-war career reflected a different kind of service. Teaching fighter pilots was less dramatic than shooting down German aircraft, but arguably more valuable. The 300 pilots he trained carried his methods into combat across the Eastern Front and later in Eastern Europe. Each of them taught other pilots. The tactical knowledge propagated through the Soviet Air Force like ripples from a stone dropped in water. One man's innovation became institutional knowledge that shaped operations for years. The contrast between his combat record and his teaching career is instructive. Chirkov was credited with 22 kills, respectable but not extraordinary for a pilot who survived the entire war. His real contribution wasn't the aircraft he destroyed personally, but the tactical framework he created that allowed hundreds of other pilots to survive and succeed. Legacy measured by direct personal achievement misses the larger impact. His value was multiplied through every pilot who learned his methods and lived long enough to teach them to someone else. Historical memory tends to focus on individual heroics rather than institutional adaptation. The ace with 50 kills gets remembered. The tactician whose methods saved 50 pilots gets forgotten. Cherkov's recognition during his lifetime was limited precisely because his most important work was teaching and doctrinal development. Those contributions don't generate dramatic stories or impressive statistics. They just quietly save lives and win wars. His death in 1979 went largely unnoticed outside of aviation circles. The four-sentence obituary mentioned his military service, but focused on his post-war meteorology career. None of his former students were contacted for comment. No retrospectives examined his tactical innovations or their impact on Soviet air doctrine. He was buried with military honors appropriate to his rank and awards, then faded from public memory. The tactics he pioneered outlived him, but were rarely attributed to him by name. This pattern of forgotten innovation is common in military history. Most tactical advances emerge through incremental adaptation by multiple individuals rather than single dramatic breakthrough. Even when one person makes a key conceptual leap, the idea gets refined and spread by many others until the original source is obscured. Cherkov's cloud trap was copied, modified, improved, and integrated into doctrine by dozens of officers over months and years. By 1945, no one remembered who had first thought of using weather to trap enemy fighters. It was just something Soviet pilots did. The archival research that eventually reconnected Cherkov to his tactical innovation happened decades after his death. Military historians studying Soviet Air Force records from 1942 noticed the doctrinal shift in late November and traced it back to specific after-action reports. Cherkov's detailed account of the engagement stood out because of its technical depth and meteorological focus. Cross-referencing training curricula from 1943 revealed his reassignment to teaching duties immediately after the engagement. The pattern became clear only in retrospect. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Modern pilots flying aircraft that can operate in any weather might struggle to understand why cloud layers mattered in 1942. Current fighter doctrine assumes all-weather capability. Radar can track targets through clouds. GPS provides precise navigation regardless of visibility. Weapons can engage enemies beyond visual range. The constraints Cherkov operated under seem almost quaint from a modern perspective, but those constraints were absolute reality for pilots in 1942, and working within them required creativity that technology has since rendered unnecessary. The comparison raises questions about whether technological advancement reduces the need for tactical innovation. If your aircraft can fight effectively in any conditions, does understanding those conditions still matter? Modern air forces generally answer yes. Technology fails. Jamming disrupts communications and sensors. Political constraints limit weapon employment. Tactical innovation remains valuable even with superior equipment, because warfare always involves uncertainty and limitation. The specific innovations change, but the underlying requirement for creative adaptation persists. Cherkov's engagement also demonstrates the value of specialized knowledge in combat roles. His meteorology background was incidental to his assignment as a fighter pilot. The Soviet Air Force didn't recruit him for his weather expertise, but that specialized knowledge provided tools he could apply to tactical problems in ways that purely military training wouldn't have suggested. Modern military forces increasingly recognize that diverse backgrounds and expertise create innovation opportunities that homogeneous training pipelines miss. The lesson extends beyond aviation. Special operations forces recruit members with specialized skills in languages, engineering, medicine, and other fields because those skills create tactical options. Intelligence analysts with academic backgrounds in regional studies provide insights that professional intelligence officers might miss. Cyber warfare specialists come from programming backgrounds that military training can't replicate. Cherkov's story from 1942 foreshadowed a trend that has become central to modern military effectiveness. His decision to risk the cloud engagement also illustrates the relationship between individual initiative and institutional effectiveness. Soviet military culture is often characterized as rigid and centralized, with little room for individual tactical decision-making. Cherkov's engagement contradicts that stereotype. He made a highly unorthodox tactical decision based on personal analysis of weather data. His wingmen objected over the radio. He broke radio discipline to give orders that contradicted standard doctrine, and his superiors recognized the value of what he had done rather than punishing the deviation. This suggests that effective military organizations find ways to balance standardization with flexibility. Doctrine provides a baseline that works in most situations, but exceptional results require individuals who can recognize when circumstances warrant deviation and possess the judgment to deviate productively. Chirkov's commanders created an environment where that kind of initiative was possible and rewarded rather than punished. The result was tactical innovation that reshaped an entire campaign. The strategic implications were profound. Air superiority over Stalingrad shifted gradually through late 1942 and early 1943 as Soviet fighters adopted weather-based tactics. German bombers found it increasingly difficult to attack Soviet positions without prohibitive losses. Luftwaffe fighters couldn't maintain standing patrols because Soviet aircraft would ambush them from cloud cover. The grinding attrition favored the Soviets, who had shorter supply lines and increasing aircraft production. Stalingrad ultimately fell to Soviet forces in February 1943. Air superiority was one of multiple factors contributing to the German defeat, but it mattered significantly. Luftwaffe inability to provide effective air support for surrounded German ground forces accelerated the collapse. Supply aircraft trying to reach the encircled troops were intercepted at unsustainable rates. The tactical shift Chirkov helped initiate contributed to strategic outcomes that changed the trajectory of the entire war. Measuring his individual contribution to those outcomes is impossible. Thousands of pilots, ground crews, commanders, and support personnel contributed to Soviet victory at Stalingrad. Chirkov's role was one small piece of an enormous combined arms operation, but small pieces sometimes have outsized effects. His tactical innovation propagated through the force at a critical moment. The timing mattered as much as the innovation itself. A clever tactic introduced in 1944 when the Soviets already dominated the air would have been less significant. Introduced in November 1942 when the air battle was still contested, it helped tip the balance. Historical causation is complex and multifaceted. No single individual or event determines outcomes in conflicts as large as World War II. But recognizing that complexity shouldn't obscure the reality that individual actions matter. Chirkov's decision to study weather reports and conceive a tactic based on cloud ceilings created ripple effects that influenced how air combat was fought for the rest of the war. That kind of individual agency within vast impersonal forces is worth acknowledging and understanding. His story also serves as a reminder that warfare rewards preparedness combined with opportunity recognition. Chirkov had the meteorology knowledge because of his academic background. He had the opportunity to apply it because the right weather conditions occurred during his mission assignment. He recognized the opportunity and had the skill and courage to exploit it. Remove any one of those elements and the engagement either doesn't happen or doesn't succeed. Success required preparation, meeting opportunity at exactly the right moment. Modern military training tries to create situations where personnel are prepared for opportunities they can't predict. Cross-training, diverse educational backgrounds, tactical flexibility, and encouragement of initiative are all attempts to maximize the probability that someone will recognize and exploit unexpected opportunities. Chirkov's engagement is a historical case study in why those institutional investments matter. The Soviet Air Force got return on investment from his meteorology education in ways no one could have anticipated when he was a student. The final lesson from his story concerns legacy and memory. Chirkov lived to age 57, dying of natural causes 34 years after the engagement that changed air combat doctrine. He taught hundreds of pilots. He contributed to meteorology. He lived a full post-war life. But his most significant contribution came from 11 minutes over Stalingrad in November 1942. Everything else, including 3 decades of post-war work, was footnote to those 11 minutes. That compression of significance into brief moments is characteristic of warfare. Decades of preparation and experience culminate in seconds or minutes, where everything matters absolutely. Chirkov trained for years to become a competent pilot. He survived months of combat to reach the point where he had the experience to attempt a risky tactic. And then one engagement, one decision to climb into those clouds, defined his historical importance more than everything else combined. The men he killed experienced the same compression from a different angle. 3 pilots with their own histories, training, and futures reduced to debris scattered across frozen steppe because they followed a target into weather they didn't understand. Their lives ended in the time it took Chirkov to fire 2 bursts from his cannon. War compresses human value and potential into fragments of time where luck and skill and circumstance converge into outcomes that can't be undone or revised. Remembering these moments serves multiple purposes. It honors the sacrifice of those who fought. It preserves tactical and strategic lessons for future generations. It reminds us that individual decisions matter even in vast, impersonal conflicts. And it provides context for understanding how warfare evolves through the accumulated innovation of individuals who refuse to accept that current methods are the only possible methods. Chirkov refused to accept that Soviet fighters were doomed to fly defensively against superior German aircraft. He looked for asymmetries he could exploit. He found one in the relationship between cloud ceilings, aircraft performance, and pilot skill. He tested his theory with his life as the wager. He won. And the ripple effects from that victory changed how thousands of subsequent pilots fought and survived. That legacy, largely forgotten and rarely attributed, represents one small example of how wars are actually won, not through grand strategy alone, but through countless small innovations by individuals who see possibilities others miss. One Soviet pilot used cloud altitude to trap German fighters. Within 72 hours, tactical doctrine changed. Within 3 months, air superiority shifted. One man, one engagement, ripples across years and continents. The story is specific to 1942, but the pattern is timeless. Innovation under pressure, individual agency within institutional structures, tactical creativity, overcoming technological disadvantage. These themes recur because they reflect fundamental truths about how humans adapt to existential challenges. Cherkov's story is worth remembering not just for what he did, but for what his actions represent about human capacity for creative problem-solving when everything is at stake. The tactical shift Cherkov initiated didn't remain confined to the Soviet Air Force. By spring 1943, intelligence reports from German sources began appearing in British and American briefing documents. RAF analysts studying Luftwaffe loss patterns noticed an unusual spike in weather-related incidents on the Eastern Front. The correlation between cloud cover and German fighter casualties was too pronounced to be coincidental. Someone on the Soviet side had figured out how to weaponize meteorology. British intelligence requested information through liaison channels in Moscow. The Soviet response was cautious but cooperative. They provided sanitized after-action reports that described weather-based tactics without revealing specific technical details or naming individual pilots. RAF Fighter Command received these reports in April 1943 and immediately recognized their value. Squadron leaders were briefed on the concept of using cloud layers as tactical terrain. Pilots were encouraged to study weather forecasts with the same attention they gave enemy aircraft recognition. The application in Western Europe differed from the Eastern Front. British pilots flying Spitfires and Hurricanes faced different opponents in different conditions. The Luftwaffe units defending occupied France were generally more experienced and better equipped than the units fighting in Russia. German radar coverage over the Channel was more comprehensive, but the fundamental principle remained valid. Weather could be exploited to create engagement conditions that favored the defender. RAF squadrons began experimenting with cloud ambush tactics in summer 1943. The results were mixed initially. British pilots had been trained to fight in clear conditions where visibility and altitude advantages mattered most. Transitioning to low-visibility combat required different skills and instincts. Several early attempts ended badly when pilots lost spatial orientation in clouds or collided with terrain while maneuvering at low altitude and poor visibility. The learning curve was steep and paid for in aircraft and lives. But some squadrons adapted quickly. Number 611, squadron based at Biggin Hill, developed a variation of Cherkov's tactics specifically designed for intercepting German fighter bombers attacking coastal targets. They positioned standing patrols just below cloud layers at specific altitudes, using ground radar to vector them toward incoming raids. When German formations approached, the Spitfires would climb into the clouds, circle to gain position, then drop down onto the enemy from above and behind, with cloud cover concealing their approach until the last moment. The tactic worked brilliantly against FW-190 fighter bombers carrying ordnance. The German pilots were focused on their ground attack mission and didn't expect interception from cloud cover they assumed was empty. By the time they recognized the threat, Spitfires were already in gun range. Number 611 Squadron claimed 18 victories using this method between June and September 1943, with only 2 losses. Other squadrons studied their approach and adapted it to their own operational areas. American pilots arriving in England in late 1943 received briefings that included weather exploitation tactics derived from both Soviet and British experience. The USAAF had its own tactical doctrine emphasizing formation discipline and mutual support, but they recognized the value of environmental awareness. Fighter groups assigned to bomber escort missions were particularly interested in techniques for using clouds to mask approach routes and surprise German interceptors. The 56th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, developed a hybrid approach that combined American formation tactics with weather-based positioning. They would escort bomber formations in standard defensive spread, but when German fighters appeared, one flight would break off and climb into nearby cloud cover. The Germans would focus on the visible escorts, not realizing additional fighters were circling in the clouds above. When the German attack developed, the hidden flight would drop out of the clouds and hit the enemy from an unexpected angle. The tactic required precise timing and excellent radio discipline, but it was devastatingly effective when executed properly. German intelligence recognized the pattern, but struggled to counter it effectively. Luftwaffe tactical guidance emphasized maintaining formation integrity and avoiding pursuit into clouds. But these defensive measures meant surrendering initiative to Allied fighters who could use weather as they chose. The psychological impact was significant. German pilots who had once hunted aggressively across the skies of occupied Europe now flew cautiously, avoiding engagements in marginal weather, focusing on survival rather than victory. The doctrinal evolution continued through 1944, as Allied air forces prepared for the Normandy invasion. Weather would be a critical factor in the landings, and fighter commanders wanted their pilots comfortable operating in the low clouds and poor visibility expected over the Channel in early June. Training intensity increased. Pilots flew repeated sorties practicing formation, flying in clouds, navigation by instruments alone, and coordinated attacks emerging from weather that reduced visibility to near zero. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The invasion itself demonstrated how thoroughly weather-based tactics had been integrated into Allied air operations. On D-Day morning, cloud cover extended from 800 to 3,000 feet across most of the invasion area. Allied fighters used this cover to mask their numbers and positions, appearing suddenly to attack German positions, then vanishing back into the clouds before effective anti-aircraft fire could be organized. Luftwaffe attempts to interfere with the landings were disrupted by Allied fighters ambushing them from cloud layers they had assumed were empty. German after-action reports from June 6th repeatedly mentioned surprise attacks from clouds. Pilots described being jumped by Spitfires and P-47s that appeared without warning, made one attack pass, then disappeared before the Germans could respond. The tactic prevented the Luftwaffe from organizing effective resistance to Allied air operations over the beaches. By the end of D-Day, German fighter units had lost over 40 aircraft while shooting down fewer than 10 Allied planes. The kill ratio represented a complete reversal from 1940 when the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies over France. The tactical lineage from Cherkov's November 1942 engagement to Normandy operations in June 1944 is clear in archived operational plans and training documents. While Allied pilots never knew the name of the Soviet meteorology student who first conceived cloud ambush tactics, they flew missions using principles he had pioneered. The knowledge had propagated through intelligence sharing, tactical experimentation, and institutional learning across multiple air forces. What began as one pilot's creative solution to a specific problem had become standard doctrine for air forces across the Allied coalition. Soviet operations continued evolving as well. By 1944, with numerical superiority established, Soviet tactics shifted from defensive ambush to offensive hunter-killer operations. Flights of Yak-9s and LL-5s would patrol in clouds over German-held territory, waiting for targets of opportunity. German aircraft attempting to move between airfields or conduct reconnaissance would suddenly find themselves under attack from fighters that appeared out of cloud banks with no warning. The tables had turned completely from 1942. Now, Soviet pilots owned the weather, while Germans flew defensively trying to avoid it. The Eastern Front Air War in 1944 bore little resemblance to the desperate defensive fighting of 1942. Soviet aircraft production had reached levels that allowed near-constant patrols over frontline areas. Improved training meant new pilots arrived at operational units with skills that would have been considered advanced 2 years earlier, and the tactical doctrine built on Cherkov's foundation gave Soviet pilots tools to exploit weather conditions that German opponents still hadn't fully countered. Individual Soviet pilots accumulated remarkable records using weather-based tactics. Alexander Pokrishkin, who became the second highest-scoring Soviet ace with 59 confirmed kills, was known for using clouds to set up attacks. He would position his flight in cloud cover near known German approach routes, wait for radar or ground observer reports of enemy aircraft, then attack from concealment. His tactical approach was methodical and professional, focused on using every available advantage rather than individual heroics. Pokrishkin credited his survival and success to lessons learned from pilots like Cherkov, who had pioneered environmental exploitation tactics early in the war. In post-war interviews, he specifically mentioned the importance of studying weather and using it tactically. He described meteorology as equal in importance to gunnery and aircraft recognition. That perspective, from a pilot who survived the entire war and achieved ace status many times over, validated the doctrinal shift that Cherkov's engagement had initiated. The Pacific Theater saw a similar tactical evolution through parallel development rather than direct knowledge transfer. American pilots fighting Japanese aircraft in the South Pacific discovered independently that weather could be used tactically. The tropical environment created different conditions than Europe or Russia. Towering cumulus clouds, sudden rainstorms, and limited visibility near the water surface all created opportunities for pilots who understood how to exploit them. Marine Corps pilots flying F-4U Corsairs developed tactics for using rain squalls to approach Japanese-held islands undetected, attack ground targets, then escape back into the weather before Japanese fighters could intercept. Navy pilots learned to use cloud cover over the Pacific to set up attacks on Japanese shipping. The specific techniques differed from European tactics because the environment and opponent were different, but the underlying principle was identical. Use weather to create conditions that favor your strengths and negate enemy advantages. Japanese pilots attempted similar tactics but with less success. Their aircraft generally had better maneuverability than American planes, but worse high-speed performance and durability. Using clouds for ambush required the ability to slow down, position carefully, then accelerate away after the attack. American aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and P-38 Lightning excelled at this profile. Japanese aircraft like the Zero could outturn American planes in clear air, but struggled to execute the speed transitions required for effective cloud ambush tactics. The result was another example of how tactical innovation requires matching methods to equipment capabilities. Cherkov's tactics worked because the Yak-1 could fly slowly and turn tightly in conditions where the Bf-109 lost its advantages. American tactics in the Pacific worked because their aircraft could use weather for approach, then rely on speed and firepower for escape. Japanese attempts to copy these methods failed because their aircraft were optimized for different performance profiles. Innovation isn't just about having good ideas, but about implementing ideas that match your tools and circumstances. By 1945, weather-based air combat tactics had become so thoroughly integrated into operational doctrine that they were no longer considered innovative. Pilots learned them in basic training, alongside navigation and gunnery. Meteorology officers were standard personnel in every fighter squadron. Pre-mission briefings included detailed weather analysis as routine practice. What had been a creative breakthrough in 1942 was institutional knowledge by war's end. The transition from innovation to routine is characteristic of military adaptation. Successful tactical concepts get copied, refined, and systematized until they're no longer special, but simply the way things are done. The pilots flying missions in 1945 using cloud cover tactically had no idea they were employing methods pioneered by a Soviet meteorology student 3 years earlier. They just knew it worked and had been trained to do it that way. Post-war analysis of air combat statistics revealed the magnitude of the impact. Allied and Soviet air forces suffered significantly lower loss rates in 1944-1945 compared to 1941-1943, despite flying more sorties against increasingly desperate German defenses. Part of this improvement came from numerical superiority and better aircraft, but tactical factors mattered as well. Pilots who understood how to use weather survived longer and achieved better results than those who flew in clear conditions only. German loss rates told the inverse story. Luftwaffe casualties climbed steadily through 1944 despite fielding improved aircraft like the FW-190D and Me-262 jet. Superior technology couldn't compensate for tactical disadvantages and numerical inferiority. German pilots found themselves fighting defensively in conditions chosen by their opponents, using tactics that had been effective in 1940 but were obsolete by 1944. The doctrinal gap compounded the material disadvantages. Cherkov's contribution to this outcome was indirect but real. His tactical innovation in November 1942 catalyzed a shift in how Soviet forces approached air combat. That shift propagated through intelligence sharing to other Allied air forces. By 1944, the accumulated effect of thousands of pilots employing weather-based tactics created conditions where Luftwaffe effectiveness was systematically degraded. One engagement didn't win the air war, but it initiated changes that contributed meaningfully to the eventual outcome. The human dimension of this evolution remains worth emphasizing. Every statistical improvement in kill ratios represented individual pilots living or dying based on whether they had learned tactics that increased their survival odds. The Soviet pilots trained by Cherkov in early 1943, who applied his methods in combat, had measurably higher survival rates than pilots who hadn't received that training. Those survivors went on to train other pilots, propagating the knowledge further. The institutional impact of effective tactical education compounded over time. This pattern highlights why militaries invest so heavily in training and doctrine development. Individual combat effectiveness matters, but collective effectiveness shaped by shared knowledge and tactics matters more. An air force where every pilot independently develops their own methods will be less effective than one where proven tactics are systematically taught and refined. Chirkov's engagement mattered not just because he personally shot down 3 aircraft, but because his methods were captured, taught, and spread throughout the force. Modern military education programs study this knowledge transfer process intensively. How do tactical innovations get recognized? How are they validated and refined? How do they spread from individual creativity to institutional practice? Chirkov's story provides a case study. His detailed after-action report allowed commanders to understand what he had done and why it worked. His reassignment to training duties enabled direct knowledge transfer. Soviet willingness to share sanitized versions with allies allowed cross-force learning. Each step in that process was necessary for the innovation to achieve strategic impact. The contrast with tactical innovations that failed to propagate is instructive. Many pilots during World War II conceived clever tactics that worked in specific situations. Most of those ideas died with the pilots who created them or remained localized to single units. The difference between innovations that spread and those that didn't often came down to documentation, institutional support for knowledge sharing, and training infrastructure. Chirkov benefited from all 3. His innovation succeeded not just tactically, but institutionally.